Welcome to Fairfax Docks. There are ghost towns scattered across the American West. Thousands of them. Abandoned relics of gold rushes, broken dreams, and forgotten histories. Most of them died quietly, but some were murdered, drowned in blood, built on greed, violence, and death. And of all the ghost towns in America, one stands above the rest: Bannack, Montana. Known for its lawlessness, where the sheriff himself was the deadliest criminal, and where Christmas meant public executions. Over 100 men were murdered in a single year. 21 people were hanged without trial, many during Christmas. MDO visitors report seeing shadowy figures swaying from invisible ropes, and paranormal investigators call it the most violently haunted location in the American West. But tonight, we go to Bannack, Montana, the ghost town where over 10,000 died in a single year. The hanging tree still stands, bearing scars from the past, and some say the dead refuse to stay silent. Subscribe and turn on the bell icon. Let's begin.
December 21st, 1863. I. Nevada City, Montana Territory, 11 miles from Bannack. 2:0 p.m. George Ives stood on the makeshift gallows, a noose around his neck, staring out at over 1,000 people who had gathered to watch him die. He was 27 years old, handsome, charming, a ladies' man who'd had his pick of the camp's prostitutes and reportedly even seduced a judge's daughter. He was also a cold-blooded murderer. Ives was a member of the Innocents, the road agent gang terrorizing Montana Territory. He'd been captured 3 days earlier after murdering a young German immigrant named Nicholas T. Balt, whose body had been discovered in a snowdrift, frozen solid, with 15 bullet holes and signs of brutal torture. The Vigilance Committee, the group of miners and businessmen who'd formed to combat the lawlessness, had given Ives something resembling a trial. It lasted 3 days. Over 50 witnesses testified. The evidence was overwhelming. T-Balt had been carrying gold when he left Virginia City, heading to Bannack. Ives had been seen following him. T-Balt's horse had been found in Ives' possession, and when confronted, Ives' story kept changing. On December 21st, after 3 days of testimony, the People's Court found George Ives guilty of murder. The sentence: death by hanging. Immediately. No appeal. No delay. No waiting for territorial authorities who might be months away. Frontier justice. But before the trapdoor dropped, George Ives made a deal. "Wait," Ives shouted, his voice cracking. "Wait. I'll tell you everything. I'll give you names, all of them. Everyone in the gang. Just give me time to write letters to my family. Let me make peace with God. Don't hang me like this." The vigilante leaders, Wilbur Sanders, Paris Fouts, John Lott, and others, conferred quietly, and they agreed. They would give Ives 2 hours to write his letters and confess. In exchange, he would name every member of the Innocents. And George Ives talked. "Alec Carter rides with us. Boone Helm. He's the worst of us, kills for fun. Bill Hunter, Bob Zachary, Whiskey Bill Graves. Cyrus Skinner runs a roadhouse as a front. George Shears, Ned Ray, Buck Stinson, they're Plummer's lieutenants." Sanders wrote furiously, his hand cramping. "Who else?" Ives hesitated. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "Sheriff Plummer." The room went silent. "What did you say?" Sanders said slowly. "Sheriff Henry Plummer," Ives repeated, tears now streaming down his face. "He's the leader. He plans everything. He gives us targets. He tells us when gold shipments are moving, who's carrying valuables. He's been running the gang since before he was even elected sheriff. It's all him. All of it." The vigilantes stared at each other, stunned. They'd suspected. They'd hoped they were wrong. But now they had confirmation. from a condemned man with nothing left to lose. The sheriff of Bannack, Montana, was the most dangerous criminal in the territory. Sanders stood. "Mr. Ives, you've given us valuable information. We'll ensure your letters reach your family. Now, it's time." Ives' face went white. "You said you'd spare me. You said. We said we'd give you time to make peace with God," Sanders interrupted. "And we did. But the sentence stands. You murdered Nicholas Tybalt in cold blood. You robbed him. You tortured him. And you will hang." George Ives started screaming, begging, pleading, fighting. It took 4 men to drag him to the gallows. At 4:17 p.m., the trapdoor dropped. Ives' neck snapped. He died instantly. But his confession would lead to the deaths of 20 more men. December 23rd, 1863, 11 t.m. Secret meeting of the Vigilance Committee, Masonic Hall, Bannack. Over 300 men crammed into the Masonic Hall, the largest building in Bannack, normally used for social events and dances. Tonight, it held an emergency session of the Vigilance Committee. Wilbur Sanders stood at the front, holding George Ives' confession. His voice was hoarse from hours of discussion, but it rang out clearly. "Gentlemen, we have a choice before us. We can wait for territorial authorities who may never come. We can attempt to arrest these men and hold trials that will be corrupted by their allies. Or we can act decisively tomorrow, on Christmas Eve." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some men nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. A miner named Thomas Burchett stood. "You're talking about murder, Sanders. Execution without trial. That makes us no better than them." "We had a trial," Sanders shot back. "George Ives confessed. He named names. We have witnesses. We have evidence. What more do you want?" "I want courts," Burchett said. "I want judges. I want law." "There are no courts." Sanders roared. "There are no judges. The only law in Montana Territory is what we make. And if we don't act, if we don't stop these men, the killing will never end. How many more Nicholas Tybalts have to die? How many more miners have to be robbed and murdered? How many more families have to lose fathers and sons?" Silence. Finally, Paris Faut spoke. He was a businessman, older, respected. "If we do this, if we hang these men without trial, we have to be certain. Absolutely certain. Because once we start down this road, there's no turning back." Sanders nodded. "I understand. So let's vote. All in favor of arresting and executing the men named in George Ives' confession, raise your hands." Slowly, hands went up. First a few, then dozens, then hundreds. The vote was near unanimous. "Then it's decided," Sanders said grimly. "Tomorrow, Christmas Eve, we arrest them. We give them a chance to confess." December 24th, 1863. Christmas Eve, 8:00 a.m. Bannack, Montana Territory. The town woke to the sound of hammering. In the center of Bannack, in a cleared area near the main street, vigilantes were building gallows. Not small, crude structures. Not a single noose thrown over a tree branch. But proper gallows, a sturdy wooden platform 8 feet high, with 3 nooses hanging from a thick crossbeam, designed to hang 3 men simultaneously. Children stopped on their way to school, staring wide-eyed. Women clutched their coats tighter and hurried past. Men gathered in small groups, watching, whispering. Everyone knew what was coming. By 10:00 a.m., the gallows were complete. By 11:00 a.m., the vigilantes, now numbering over 400 armed men, began making arrests. They moved quickly, efficiently, hitting multiple targets simultaneously to prevent anyone from escaping or warning the others. Ned Ray was arrested at his cabin. He fought, drawing a revolver, but was quickly disarmed and bound. Buck Stinson was taken at a saloon. He was drunk, barely able to stand, and didn't resist. George Shears was captured trying to flee town on horseback. A vigilante shot his horse out from under him, and Shears was dragged back to Bannack in the snow. All 3 men were members of the Innocents. All 3 had been named in George Ives' confession. All 3 had been personally involved in multiple robberies and murders, and all 3 would hang before sunset. 2:00 p.m. Bannack Town Center. Over 2,000 people had gathered, nearly the entire population of Bannack, plus miners and residents from nearby camps who'd heard what was happening and rushed to witness it. It looked like a festival. Families stood together. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to see better. Vendors sold coffee, whiskey, and food. Photographers set up cameras on tripods, preparing to capture the moment for posterity. This was public execution as community event. The 3 condemned men were led from the jail, hands bound behind their backs, feet shackled, and marched through the snow toward the gallows. Ned Ray walked with his head held high, his face expressionless. He said nothing, showed nothing, just stared straight ahead with cold, dead eyes. Buck Stinson was screaming, cursing, struggling against his bonds. "You bastards, you murdering bastards. I'm innocent. I ain't done nothing. This is murder. God will judge you. You'll burn in hell for this, all of you." George Shears was weeping, openly sobbing. "Please, I didn't kill nobody. I just held horses. That's all I did. I swear on my mother's grave. Please. I got a sister in California. She's only 14. Who's gonna take care of her? Please, please. I'm only 25 years old. I don't want to die. Not like this. Not on Christmas. Not on Christmas." The crowd watched. Some faces showed satisfaction. Others showed horror. Most showed nothing. Just blank acceptance that this was necessary, that this was justice. The 3 men were led up the steps of the gallows. The wood creaked under their weight. Wilbur Zander stood before them, holding a paper. He read the charges. "Ned Ray, Buck Stinson, George Shears, you stand accused of multiple counts of robbery, murder, and conspiracy against the people of Montana Territory. You were named by George Ives in his confession before his execution. You have been given the opportunity to confess and provide information about other gang members. Do any of you wish to speak?" "Go to hell," Ned Ray said flatly. "I'm innocent." Stinson screamed. "This is murder. You're all murderers. Please." Shears sobbed. "Please, not on Christmas, my sister, please." Sanders folded the paper. "Then, by the power vested in the Vigilance Committee by the citizens of Montana Territory, I hereby sentence you to death by hanging, immediately. May God have mercy on your souls." He nodded to the executioners. Black hoods were placed over the condemned men's heads. The nooses were tightened around their necks, and Wilbur Sanders raised his hand. The crowd fell silent. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just the sound of wind, the creak of wood, Shears muffled sobbing under his hood, and then Sanders dropped his hand. Ned Ray died instantly. His neck broke with an audible crack. His body jerked once, then went still. Buck Stinson's neck didn't break. The rope caught him, and he strangled. His body convulsed violently, his legs kicking, his back arching. It took 48 seconds for him to stop moving. Witnesses later said it felt like an eternity. But George Shears had the worst death. His rope had been measured incorrectly. When he dropped, his feet touched the ground. He was being strangled, but slowly, his body thrashing. Terrible, muffled choking sounds coming from under the hood. His bound hands clawing uselessly at the air behind his back. The crowd gasped. Some turned away. Others watched in horrified fascination. The vigilantes quickly pulled him up, literally hauling on the rope to lift him higher, adjusted the noose, and dropped him again. His neck still didn't break. They pulled him up a third time. By now, George Shears had been strangling for over 2 minutes. The sounds coming from under his hood were inhuman. Wet, taut, gurgling, desperate. The third drop finally broke his neck. Silence. 3 bodies swung slowly in the cold December wind. It was 3:47 p.m. on Christmas Eve, 1863, and Bannack, Montana had just witnessed its first mass execution. But it wouldn't be the last. The bodies were left hanging for 2 hours as a warning. Children stood beneath them, staring up with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Photographers captured images that would later be sold as postcards and souvenirs. Men discussed whether the executions were justified. Most agreed they were. Some had doubts. A few were horrified. But everyone agreed on one thing. Montana territory had changed forever, because the vigilantes weren't done. Over the next 7 weeks, they would execute 18 more men. On December 26th, the day after Christmas, 4 more hangings in Virginia City. On January 10th, 1864, Sheriff Henry Plummer himself, along with 2 of his lieutenants, hanged in Bannack. The same words George Shears allegedly said as he died. When the equipment came back online 5 minutes later, one of the investigators, a woman named Rachel Torres, who'd been investigating haunted locations for 15 years, refused to continue. In an interview afterward, she said, "I've investigated some of the most famously haunted places in America. Eastern State Penitentiary, Waverly Hills, the Villisca Axe Murder House. And I've never felt anything like what I felt in Bannack that day. It wasn't residual energy. It wasn't an imprint. Those were conscious spirits. And they were suffering. Still suffering after 158 years. They're not just haunting that location. They're trapped there, reliving their executions over and over. And I could feel them pleading, begging for help, for release, for someone to acknowledge that what happened to them was wrong. Some of those men were guilty. But George Shears, I don't think he killed anyone. And he died screaming for mercy that never came. That kind of trauma, it doesn't just fade. It embeds itself. And it's still there, still active, still screaming. My house." Rachel Torres never returned to Bannack. And she's not alone. Dozens of paranormal investigators, park rangers, and visitors have reported long-term effects after visiting the hanging site on Christmas Eve. Nightmares lasting weeks or months, dreams of hanging, of suffocating, of crowds watching them die, waking up with rope marks on their necks, red, raised welts that last for days, hearing whispers in empty rooms, "Not on Christmas, not on Christmas." Phantom sensations of ropes tightening around their throats, especially when falling asleep. Overwhelming guilt and feelings of being judged. One visitor, a man from Colorado, who visited in December 2019, reported waking up every night for 2 months at exactly 3:47 a.m., unable to breathe, clutching his throat, certain he was being hanged. He finally sought help from a therapist specializing in trauma. The therapist's diagnosis: severe PTSD from an event he didn't experience, but somehow absorbed from visiting the location. The hanging site in Bannack is now marked with a simple historical plaque. It reads, "On this site, December 24th, 1863, the Montana Vigilantes executed Ned Ray, Buck Stinson, and George Shears for crimes of robbery and murder. This marked the beginning of the vigilante period in Montana territory." What the plaque doesn't say, that George Shears died screaming for mercy, that it took 3 attempts to kill him, that his last words were a plea not to be hanged on Christmas, that children watched, that the crowd cheered, and that his spirit never left. Wind howling, rope creaking, and beneath it all, barely audible, a voice whispering, "Not on Christmas, please, not on Christmas." And then now. The Frozen Gold Stagecoach Massacre. Christmas Day, 1864. December 25th, 1864. Christmas morning, 6:15 a.m. Bannack, Montana Territory. The Oliver and Company stagecoach stood ready in front of the company's office, its 6-horse team stamping impatiently in the negative 25-degree Fahrenheit cold, their breath creating clouds of steam that hung in the still air before slowly dissipating. Henry Hank Morrison, the driver, was doing his final equipment check, testing wheel spokes, examining harnesses for wear, ensuring the brake mechanism was functioning properly. At 53 years old, Morrison had been driving stagecoaches for over 20 years, first in California, then Nevada, and now Montana. He knew every inch of the Bannack, Virginia City route, having made the run over 200 times without serious incident. Beside him stood Jack Sullivan, the shotgun guard, a former Union Army sharpshooter who'd fought at Gettysburg and Antietam before coming west after the war ended in April. Sullivan was 34th, lean and hard, with eyes that never stopped moving, always scanning for threats. He carried a double-barreled shotgun loaded with buckshot and a Colt revolver on his hip. His job was simple: protect the passengers and cargo, at any cost. Today's cargo was particularly valuable. A strongbox bolted to the floor of the stagecoach's luggage compartment, containing $14,237 in gold dust, approximately $500,000 in today's currency, being transported from Bannack's assay office to the bank in Virginia City. And inside the passenger compartment, wrapped in blankets and heavy coats against the brutal cold, sat 6 people. James Whitfield, age 34, a Pennsylvania miner who'd struck a decent claim and was sending his earnings home to his wife Sarah and 3 children, ages 8, 6, and 3. For Christmas, he carried a small leather pouch containing $800 in gold dust. His family's future. Margaret O'Brien, age 28, a schoolteacher from Boston who'd come west to escape family tragedy. Her fiancé had been killed at Cold Harbor in June 1864. She was traveling to Virginia City to spend Christmas with her younger sister Catherine, who worked as a seamstress. In her carpet bag she carried gifts: a silver locket, hand-knitted scarves, peppermint candies. Thomas Chen, age 41, a Chinese merchant and herbalist who operated a small shop in Bannack. Despite facing constant discrimination and even violence from white miners, Chinese immigrants were often blamed for taking jobs and were targets of racial attacks. Chen had built a successful business supplying traditional medicines and goods to the Chinese community. He was transporting $600 in gold and a shipment of herbs and silk to his cousin's store in Virginia City. He spoke limited English but was always unfailingly polite. Samuel and Elizabeth Grant, ages 52 and 49, a married couple from Ohio who'd spent 4 brutal years mining in Bannack. They'd saved enough to purchase a boarding house in Virginia City and were finally leaving the dangerous, exhausting work of gold mining. They carried their entire life savings, $1,200 in gold and cash. Elizabeth clutched a small Bible her mother had given her before they left Ohio, its pages worn from constant reading. Father Michael Donnelly, age 38, a Catholic priest who had arrived in Montana Territory just 6 months earlier, sent by the Diocese of St. Louis to minister to the growing Catholic population in the mining camps. He was traveling to Virginia City to conduct Christmas Day Mass at the small church there. He carried only a Bible, a small silver crucifix, and his faith. 8 people, fortune in gold, and a 70-mile journey through some of the most desolate, frozen, and dangerous terrain in Montana Territory. The same route where dozens of travelers had been robbed and murdered by road agents over the past 2 years. The same route where the Innocence Gang had operated with impunity until the Vigilantes had hanged their leaders just weeks earlier. Morrison and Sullivan knew the risks. Everyone did. But it was Christmas, and after the Vigilante purge, surely the roads were safer now. Surely the violence had ended. Surely. 6:30 a.m. Departure. All aboard, Morrison called out, his voice echoing in the cold morning air. The passengers climbed into the stagecoach, settling onto the hard wooden benches, pulling blankets tight around themselves. The interior was cramped, 6 adults packed into a space designed for 4. But the shared body heat would help against the cold. Father Donnelly led them in a brief prayer. Heavenly Father, we ask your protection on this journey. Guide us safely to our destination. Protect us from harm, and bless all those who travel on this holy day of your Son's birth. In Jesus' name, Amen. Amen, the others murmured. Morrison cracked his whip, and the stagecoach lurched forward, wheels crunching on packed snow. Bannack disappeared behind them. Ahead lay 70 miles of frozen wilderness. 8:15 a.m. Mile 27th. The first 2 hours passed smoothly. The road, really just a barely marked trail winding through snow-covered hills and dense pine forests, was treacherous, but Morrison knew every curve, every creek crossing, every potential hazard. The passengers occupied themselves as best they could. They sang Christmas carols to pass the time and keep their spirits up. God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay. Remember Christ our Savior was born on Christmas Day. Their voices, discordant but earnest, echoed through the forest, the only human sound in the vast frozen wilderness. Margaret O'Brien distributed the peppermint candy she brought, and they passed around a flask of whiskey Samuel Grant had packed. Even Father Donnelly took a small sip, claiming it was medicinal against the cold. Elizabeth Grant told stories of Christmases back in Ohio. Warm houses, family gatherings, her mother's famous apple pie. James Whitfield showed everyone a small photograph of his children, their faces serious in the formal pose required by the long exposure times of 1860s photography. Thomas Chen smiled and nodded, understanding perhaps half of what was said, but appreciating the warmth and camaraderie. It was, despite the cold and discomfort, almost pleasant. But then, at approximately 8:15 a.m., Morrison pulled the horses to a sudden stop. Whoa! Whoa! The passengers lurched forward. What is it? James Whitfield called out. Morrison didn't answer. He was staring at something on the road ahead, his weathered face creased with concern. Sullivan stood up in his seat, shotgun raised, scanning the tree line. Blocking the path approximately 50 yards ahead was an overturned supply wagon, its contents scattered across the snow. Barrels, crates, bundles of supplies. It could have been an accident. Wagons overturned on icy roads frequently. But something about the scene felt wrong. Could be a trap, Sullivan said quietly, his finger on the trigger. Could be someone needs help, Morrison countered. It's Christmas morning. Sullivan didn't respond. His eyes were moving constantly, scanning the forest, the rocks, every potential hiding place. Stay here, Morrison said, climbing down from the driver's seat. I'll take a quick look. Hank, don't, Sullivan started to say. But Morrison was already walking toward the overturned wagon, his boots crunching in the snow. He approached carefully, his hand on the revolver at his hip, and then he saw the blood. A trail of it, dark red against white snow, leading from the wagon into the forest. Fresh blood, still wet. Hank, get back here. It's, Sullivan never finished the sentence. Sudden, deafening explosion of gunfire. 7, 8, 9 shots in rapid succession. Horses screaming, wood splintering, chaos. 7 men burst from the tree line, outlaws, their faces covered with bandanas, rifles, and revolvers blazing. Sullivan fired both barrels of his shotgun simultaneously, the massive blast taking down the nearest attacker and a spray of blood and buckshot. But return fire came instantly, a concentrated volley that tore through the stagecoach like paper. Morrison dove behind the overturned wagon, drawing his revolver and returning fire. He got off 3 shots before a bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Inside the stagecoach, hell erupted. Bullets punched through the wooden walls, shattering windows, ricocheting off the iron strongbox. Margaret O'Brien screamed as a bullet tore through her left shoulder, blood immediately soaking her dress. Thomas Chen pulled a small derringer from his coat, a .41 caliber pocket pistol, practically useless at range but better than nothing, and fired out the broken window at the attackers. Father Donnelly threw his body over Elizabeth Grant, trying to shield her. James Whitfield tried to open the door to escape, but was hit immediately. A bullet through his throat. He collapsed backward, blood pouring from the wound, his hands clutching uselessly at his neck, his eyes wide with terror and disbelief. Samuel Grant was screaming, "We surrender! We surrender! Take the gold! Just don't kill us!" The gunfight lasted less than 90 seconds, but when it was over, everyone was dead or dying. 8:17 p.m. Morrison lay behind the overturned wagon, bleeding out from multiple gunshot wounds. Shoulder, chest, abdomen. He was still conscious, his breath coming in shallow, rattling gasps. Sullivan was already dead, sprawled in the driver's seat, the top of his head blown off by a rifle shot. Inside the stagecoach, James Whitfield, dead. The bullet through his throat having severed his carotid artery. He bled out in seconds, his final thoughts of his wife and children who would never know what happened to him. Margaret O'Brien, critically wounded, the bullet having shattered her shoulder and nicked her subclavian artery. She was bleeding heavily, going into shock, her face pale, her breathing rapid and shallow. She would be dead within minutes. Thomas Chen, shot in the back as he tried to run for the trees. The bullet had punctured his lung. He lay face down in the snow 20 feet from the stagecoach, drowning in his own blood. Samuel and Elizabeth Grant, both wounded but alive. Samuel had taken a bullet through his thigh. Elizabeth had been grazed across her ribs. They huddled together, shaking, terrified, surrendering. Father Donnelly, hit in the side and arm but still conscious. He was trying to help Elizabeth, pressing his hand against her wound to stop the bleeding, praying, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." The outlaws approached cautiously, weapons still raised. The leader, a tall man with cold, dark eyes visible above his bandana, surveyed the carnage. "Get the strongbox," he said flatly. Two of his men climbed onto the stagecoach and used axes to break open the luggage compartment. The iron strongbox was bolted down, but they simply chopped away the surrounding wood until they could pry it free. Meanwhile, the other outlaws began looting the bodies. They pulled James Whitfield's body out of the stagecoach and rifled through his pockets, finding his leather pouch of gold dust. One of them laughed. "Merry Christmas, boys." This one was loaded. They found Thomas Chen 50 feet away, still barely alive, and shot him again, once through the head to finish him. Then they took his gold in the silk shipment, and then they turned to the survivors. "Please," Samuel Grant begged, his hands raised. "We already surrendered. You got the gold. Just let us live. It's Christmas." The leader stared at him for a long moment. Then he shot Samuel Grant in the face. Elizabeth Grant screamed, a sound of pure animal horror. The leader turned his gun on her and fired twice. Both shots hit her in the chest. She fell across her husband's body, still twitching, blood spreading across the snow. Father Donnelly stumbled to his feet, his face pale, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "In God's name, stop this. These people." "Your God ain't here, priest," the leader said, and he shot Father Donnelly 5 times. The priest fell to his knees, his Bible clutched in his hands, blood soaking the pages. His lips moved, still trying to pray, but no sound came out. And then he collapsed face first into the snow. Margaret O'Brien, barely conscious, fading fast, watched it all through dimming eyes. She tried to speak, to scream, but no sound came. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was one of the outlaws approaching, knife in hand, to cut her jewelry from her body. Morrison, still alive behind the overturned wagon, unable to move, unable to help, heard everything. The gunshots, the screams, the laughter of the outlaws as they looted the dead, and then footsteps approaching. An outlaw appeared above him, gun raised. "Please," Morrison whispered, blood bubbling from his lips. "Not on Christmas." The outlaw smiled beneath his bandana. "Merry Christmas," and pulled the trigger. The outlaws took everything: the strongbox, the passengers' gold and valuables, even their coats and boots. They left 8 bodies stripped nearly naked in the frozen wilderness, and carved into the side of the stagecoach with a knife, they left a message: "Merry Christmas from the innocents." The same gang that had supposedly been destroyed by the vigilantes. Either survivors had regrouped, or someone else had taken up the name and methods. Either way, the message was clear: the violence hadn't ended. December 28th, 1864. A supply wagon heading from Virginia City to Bannack spotted the stagecoach from a distance. The driver, a man named William Bradford, thought it had simply broken down, but as he approached, he saw the bodies. 8 of them, frozen solid, some partially eaten by wolves and coyotes, stripped of almost everything, blood frozen in dark pools, snow stained red for dozens of yards, and the message carved into the wood. Bradford vomited in the snow. Then he turned his wagon around and rode at full gallop to Virginia City to report what he'd found. The Montana vigilantes investigated thoroughly. They tracked the outlaws for weeks, following trails through the mountains, interviewing witnesses, pursuing leads. But the trail went cold. The attackers had vanished into the wilderness. No one was ever arrested. No one was ever hanged. The gold was never recovered. The Christmas Stagecoach Massacre of 1864 remains an unsolved historical crime. But the spirits of the 8 victims never left the road. Bannack, Virginia City Road, Montana State Highway 287, December 25th. The road between Bannack and Virginia City is now a maintained gravel and paved highway used year-round by tourists visiting the ghost towns. But locals refuse to drive it on Christmas Day, because on Christmas Day, people see things. In December 2020, a couple from Idaho, Mark and Jennifer Patterson, were driving from Bannack to Virginia City on Christmas afternoon. They were alone on the road. No other traffic. Clear weather. At approximately 2:30 p.m., their car radio began experiencing severe interference. Loud static, voices speaking in fragmented sentences, music that sounded like it was from the 1800s. Then the radio went completely dead. Mark checked his phone. No signal, which was odd because they'd had signal just minutes earlier. Jennifer looked out the window and gasped. "Mark, what is that?" In the rearview mirror, a stagecoach was visible on the road behind them. Not a replica, not a tourist attraction, but an actual stagecoach, wooden, weathered, pulled by 6 horses, with a driver and shotgun guard visible on the seat, and it was gaining on them. Mark pressed the accelerator, speeding up to 60 miles per hour. The stagecoach kept pace. Impossibly, it was matching their speed, the horses galloping at a pace no real horses could maintain, the wheels barely seeming to touch the ground. And then it was beside them. Jennifer could see the driver clearly. A weathered man in period clothing, his face grim, his eyes staring directly at her. She could see the passengers inside, shadowy figures visible through the windows, and she could see bullet holes in the wooden sides. Dozens of them. "Drive faster!" she screamed. Mark floored the accelerator, reaching 80 miles per hour on the narrow road, and the stagecoach vanished. Just gone, as if it had never been there. They drove the rest of the way to Virginia City in terrified silence. When they checked their car afterward, they found something that made them never return to Montana. Fresh bullet holes in the passenger side doors. Not real holes. The metal wasn't actually damaged, but shadows of bullet holes, dark circular marks approximately the size of rifle bullets, arranged in a pattern consistent with someone firing multiple shots at the car. The marks were visible for 3 days before fading completely. Silence. Wind howling. Other reports from drivers on Christmas Day include bloodstains appearing on the road, fresh, wet red, that vanish when investigated, sounds of gunshots and screaming echoing from the forest with no source, sudden, overwhelming feelings of terror that forced drivers to pull over, phantom figures appearing in headlights, 8 people standing on the road, blood-stained and frozen, who vanish when approached. Cold spots inside vehicles so intense they cause windows to frost over despite heaters running at full blast. And at the exact location where the massacre occurred, marked now by a small historical sign reading Oliver and Company Stagecoach Attack Site. December 25, 1864. Visitors report hearing voices, begging, pleading, praying. Please take the gold. Just let us live. In God's name, stop this. It's Christmas, please. It's Christmas. And one voice, young, female, dying, whispering, tell my sister. Tell Catherine I love her. Wind howling, distant gunshots, screaming, then silence. Margaret O'Brien's sister Catherine never learned what happened to her. The bodies weren't identified for weeks, and by the time Catherine received word, Margaret had been buried in an unmarked grave with the other victim. Catherine spent the rest of her life wondering if Margaret had suffered, if she'd been afraid, if she'd thought of her in her final moments. The answer is yes, because Margaret O'Brien is still there, still bleeding in the snow, still watching the man with the knife approach, still dying, over and over, every Christmas day, forever. The Sinclair Boarding House Murders, December 1867. Sound of creaking floorboards, muffled voices, wind howling outside, rattling windows, a door opening and closing, footsteps on stairs, crackling fire in a wood stove. December 15th, 1867. Sinclair Boarding House, Bannack. By 1867, Bannack was dying. The easy gold was long gone. The population had plummeted from its peak of 10,000 to barely 600 people. Most businesses had closed. Streets that had once bustled with activity were now half empty. But Dorothy Sinclair's boarding house remained open, one of the few establishments in Bannack that still felt alive, still offered warmth and community in a town slowly freezing to death. Dorothy Sinclair was 59 years old, a widow from Edinburgh, Scotland, who'd emigrated to America with her husband Malcolm in 1862. They'd come to Montana Territory chasing the gold rush dream, like thousands of others. But Malcolm had died during their first winter. Pneumonia, complicated by frostbite, leaving Dorothy alone in a foreign land with a small 2-story cabin and no means of support. So she'd converted the cabin into a boarding house, offering rooms and home-cooked meals to miners, drifters, and anyone else who could pay the modest rates. She charged 50 cents per night for a bed and 25 cents for supper, usually stew, bread, and coffee. It wasn't much, but it kept her alive. By December 1867, Dorothy had 7 permanent boarders, men who'd been living at the boarding house for weeks or months, paying weekly rates, becoming almost like family. The boarders were William Bill Kramer, age 42, a former miner from Pennsylvania, now working odd jobs around Bannack, carpentry, hauling, whatever paid. He was quiet, reliable, always paid on time. Dorothy liked him. Thomas O'Shea, age 36, an Irish immigrant and skilled carpenter. He built most of the furniture in the boarding house and refused payment, saying Dorothy's cooking was payment enough. He had a thick accent, a booming laugh, and endless stories about Ireland. The other boarders loved him. Samuel Yates, age of 51, a prospector who'd been mining in Montana for 12 years without ever making a significant strike. He was quiet, often melancholy, but harmless. He spent his days panning in nearby creeks and his evenings reading warm copies of Shakespeare by candlelight. Henry Blackwell, age 29, the youngest boarder, a bookish man who worked at Bannack's assay office testing ore samples and keeping records. He was shy, awkward around women, but sweet. Dorothy treated him like a son. Jacob Morrison, age 45, Bannack's blacksmith, a man with arms like tree trunks and hands scarred from years of working hot metal. He was gentle despite his size, and he helped Dorothy with heavy work around the boarding house without being asked. Martin Wade, age 33, a drifter who'd arrived in Bannack just 2 weeks earlier, claiming to be looking for mining work. He was polite, well-spoken, always paid in cash. But something about him made Dorothy uncomfortable. His eyes were cold. His smile never quite reached those eyes. And she'd noticed small things going missing since he'd arrived. A silver spoon, a pocket watch belonging to Thomas O'Shea, a few dollars from her lockbox. She had no proof, just instinct. Charles Rook, age 38, another recent arrival, friends with Martin Wade. They'd come to Bannack together. Rook was quieter, less personable, but seemed harmless enough. December 18th, 1867. 7 p.m. Dorothy served the evening meal. Venison stew, cornbread, dried apple pie, coffee, and the 7 boarders gathered around the long wooden table, eating, talking, making plans for Christmas. "My sister's sending a package from Pennsylvania," Bill Kramer said. "Should arrive any day now. She bakes the best gingerbread cookies you ever tasted. I'll share 'em with everyone." "That's kind of you, Bill," Dorothy said warmly. "I'm planning to work through Christmas," Jacob Morrison rumbled. "Miners don't take holidays, so blacksmiths don't either. But I'll take Christmas evening off. Maybe we can all have a drink together. Toast those who aren't here anymore." A moment of silence. They were all thinking of the same thing, the hundreds of men who died in Bannack over the past 5 years. Hanged, murdered, frozen, dead in mining accidents. Thomas O'Shea broke the somber mood with a story about Christmas in Ireland, something involving a priest, a pig, and a barrel of whiskey that had everyone laughing. Even Martin Wade was smiling. But Dorothy noticed that Wade's eyes weren't smiling. They were watching, studying, calculating. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December cold outside. December 22nd, 1867, 3 a.m. Dorothy woke to the sound of screaming. A man's voice, terrified, coming from upstairs. She bolted upright, her heart hammering. For a moment she thought she dreamed it. But then she heard it again. "Help! Oh God, help me!" The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by a horrible gurgling sound. Dorothy grabbed a candle with shaking hands and rushed into the hallway. Other boarders were emerging from their rooms, confused, alarmed. "What's happening?" Jacob Morrison demanded. "Upstairs," Dorothy said, her voice trembling. "Room 3. They climbed the stairs. Dorothy, Jacob, Thomas, Henry, Samuel, and found Bill Kramer's door standing open, and saw blood seeping out from underneath, spreading across the hallway floor in a dark pool. Jacob pushed the door fully open, and they all saw hell. Gasps. Someone retching. Thomas O'Shea whispering a prayer in Gaelica. Bill Kramer was lying in his bed, his throat cut from ear to ear. The wound was so deep his head was nearly severed. Blood soaked the sheets, the pillow, the floor. It was everywhere, splattered on the walls, the ceiling, pooling around the bed. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. And in his hand, clutched so tight they'd have to break his fingers to remove it, was a small piece of paper. Henry Blackwell, the only one with enough composure to approach the body, carefully extracted the paper and read it aloud, his voice shaking. Martin Wade. Bill Kramer's final act had been to write his killer's name in his own blood on a scrap of paper. They searched the boarding house immediately. Martin Wade and Charles Rook were gone. Their rooms were empty. Their belongings were gone. And so was Dorothy's lockbox, containing $347 in cash, her entire savings. The remaining 5 boarders and Dorothy searched Bannack for hours. They alerted what little law enforcement existed, a part-time constable who was mostly useless. They questioned neighbors, business owners, anyone who might have seen Wade and Rook leaving. Nothing. The 2 men had vanished into the December night, but the nightmare wasn't over. Over the next 3 nights, 3 more boarders were murdered. December 23rd, 1867, 4:30 a.m. Thomas O'Shea was found dead in his bed, strangled with a rope. His face was purple, his tongue protruding, his eyes bulging. Defensive wounds on his hands indicated he'd fought his attacker, but the rope had been pulled tight from behind, and he'd had no chance. December 24th, 1867. Christmas Eve, 2:15 a.m. Samuel Yates was found dead in his room, his skull crushed by multiple blows from a heavy object, likely a hammer or rock. Blood and brain matter were splattered across the walls. His copy of Hamlet lay open beside him, the pages soaked in blood. December 25th, 1867. Christmas morning, 5 a.m. Jacob Morrison, the massive blacksmith who should have been able to defend himself, was found dead in the workshop behind the boarding house, stabbed 17 times in the back, chest, and throat. He'd been working on a project for Dorothy, a new bed frame as a Christmas gift, when someone had attacked him from behind. The pattern was clear. Someone was systematically murdering Dorothy's boarders, and that someone was getting back inside the boarding house despite locked doors and windows. The three survivors, Dorothy, Henry Blackwell, and surprisingly, Charles Rook, Martin Wade's supposed friend, who'd returned to the boarding house claiming he'd been away visiting a mine and knew nothing about the murder, barricaded themselves in the main room. They pushed furniture against the doors. They armed themselves with knives, an axe, and an old revolver Dorothy's husband had left behind. It had 3 bullets. They took turns keeping watch. They didn't sleep. They couldn't sleep. And they waited. December 25th, 1867, 11:47 p.m. Christmas night. They'd been barricaded for nearly 20 hours. Exhausted, terrified, paranoid. And then they heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, walking across the second floor. But the second floor was empty. They were all in the main room. No one had gone upstairs. "Someone's in the house," Henry whispered, his face pale. "Impossible," Rook said. "We locked everything." But the footsteps continued, getting closer, moving toward the stairs, coming down. Dorothy raised the revolver with shaking hands, pointing it at the door. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. Silence. 30 seconds of absolute silence. And then the door handle rattled. Once, twice, and then the door opened. Slowly, impossibly. The furniture they'd piled against it didn't move. The door simply passed through it, as if the physical barricade didn't exist. His clothes were soaked in blood, so much blood that it dripped onto the floor in thick drops. His face was pale and motionless, and in his right hand, a knife. The same knife he used to kill 4 people. "Evening, folks," Wade said calmly, as if he'd just returned from a walk. "Merry Christmas." Dorothy fired. The bullet hit Wade square in the chest, the impact staggering him backward. He looked down at the wound, almost curious, and then he smiled. "You'll have to do better than that." Dorothy fired again. Again. The third and final bullet. All 3 shots hit him, chest, abdomen, and Martin Wade kept walking toward them. Charles Rook suddenly lunged at Wade with the axe, swinging it in a wild arc that caught Wade in the shoulder, burying the blade deep. Wade didn't even flinch. He turned toward Rook, grabbed him by the throat with his free hand, and lifted him off the ground. A feat of impossible strength. Rook clawed at Wade's hand, his face turning purple, his legs kicking uselessly, and Wade threw him across the room like a rag doll. Rook hit the wall with a sickening crack and collapsed, his neck bent at an unnatural angle. Dead. Henry Blackwell tried to run. Wade caught him in 2 steps, stabbed him once through the back, the blade punching through his spine and out his chest. Henry fell, blood pouring from his mouth, his eyes wide with shock and terror. Dorothy was alone. She backed against the wall, nowhere left to run, the empty revolver still clutched in her hands. Wade approached slowly, the knife dripping blood, his wound still bleeding but apparently not slowing him down at all. "Please," Dorothy whispered. Why? Why are you doing this? Wade tilted his head, considering the question. Because I can, he said simply. Because you're here. Because it's Christmas, and Christmas is forgiving. He raised the knife, and Dorothy Sinclair screamed. Sudden sound of a gunshot. Wade staggers. Another gunshot. The boarding house door burst open, and 3 men rushed in. Miners from down the street who'd heard Dorothy's screams and the gunshots. They fired at Wade. 7 shots hitting him in various places. And finally Martin Wade collapsed. He fell to the floor, blood pooling around him, his body twitching once, twice, and then still. Dorothy collapsed against the wall, sobbing hysterically. The miners approached Wade's body cautiously, weapons still raised. One of them, a man named Frank Dooley, kicked Wade's knife away and checked for a pulse. He's dead, Dooley confirmed. Finally, when authorities investigated Martin Wade's true identity, they discovered he was actually Martin Hollis, a wanted murderer from California, suspected in at least 9 killings across 3 states. His method was always the same. He'd arrive in a town, stay at a boarding house, gain the residents' trust, then systematically murder them over several nights, steal their valuables, and then move on. Bannack was supposed to be his last stop before fleeing to Canada, but Dorothy Sinclair and 3 armed miners had ended him. The Sinclair boarding house stood empty for years after the murders. Dorothy sold it immediately and left Montana, unable to bear living in the building where 5 men had died. The structure eventually burned down in 1889 under mysterious circumstances. Some said Dorothy herself returned and set the fire, wanting to destroy the cursed building once and for all. But locals say that if you visit the site where the boarding house once stood, now just an empty lot with a few foundation stones, you still hear things, especially during December, especially on Christmas night. Visitors report hearing footsteps walking through rooms that no longer exist, upstairs that were destroyed over a century ago. They hear voices, men talking, laughing, screaming. And on Christmas night at 11:47 p.m., the exact time Martin Wade returned to the boarding house for his final killings, people report seeing a figure, tall, mild, covered in blood, walking slowly through the empty lot, carrying a knife. And if you're foolish enough to stay and watch, the figure turns toward you and smiles, and you hear a voice, calm, emotionless, inhuman, whisper, "Merry Christmas." The Christmas Eve church fire, 1872. Church bells ringing, choir singing carols, children's voices, then crackling flames, screaming, chaos. December 24th, 1872, 8 p.m. St. Mary's Catholic Church, Bannack. Christmas Eve Mass was the most sacred event of the year for Bannack's small but devout Catholic community. Despite everything, the violence, the deaths, the town's slow collapse, the faithful still gathered to celebrate the birth of Christ. That year, 43 people attended. Men, women, and 17 children. Father Patrick O'Malley led the service. They sang Silent Night. Oh, come all ye faithful. They lit candles. They prayed for peace. At 9:47 p.m., the church caught fire. No one knew how it started. One moment, everything was fine. The next, flames were climbing the wooden walls with impossible speed. The congregation panicked, rushing for the door. It was locked. From the outside, men threw themselves against it. It wouldn't budge. The windows were small, too small for adults. They tried to break them wider to push children through, but the fire was too fast. Within 3 minutes, the entire structure was engulfed. Within 5 minutes, the screaming stopped. By the time help arrived, all 43 were dead, charred beyond recognition. The church collapsed into smoldering rubble. Investigators found evidence of arson. Accelerant poured around the building's base, the door deliberately barred from outside. Someone had murdered 43 people, including 17 children, on Christmas Eve. No one was ever caught. The ruins of St. Mary's Church still exist in Bannack, just a stone foundation and a few blackened beams. But on Christmas Eve, visitors hear singing. 43 voices. Silent night. And if you approach the ruins at 9:47 p.m., you smell smoke. Fresh smoke. As if the fire is still burning. And you hear screaming. 43 people. Burning alive. Forever. The Last Vigilantes, Christmas 1879. Rope creaking. Wind howling. A single set of footsteps. Heavy breathing. December 25th, 1879. Christmas morning. William Sanders, now 71 years old, frail and haunted, lived alone in a cabin outside Bannack. He was the last surviving member of the original Montana Vigilantes. He participated in over a dozen hangings during the purge of 1863 to 64. He'd helped execute Sheriff Henry Plummer. He'd pulled the lever that dropped trapdoor. For 16 years, he'd lived with the guilt. On Christmas morning, 1879, neighbors found Sanders hanging from a beam in his cabin. Suicide, the authorities ruled. But those who saw the body noticed something impossible. The rope had 3 knots, the same type the vigilantes used for executions, and carved into the cabin wall in Sanders' own shaking handwriting. They came back. All of them. Merry Christmas. The Frozen Orphan Train, Christmas 1876. Sound of train wheels on frozen tracks, rhythmic and haunting. Children coughing. Wind howling through gaps in wooden railcar walls. A woman's voice singing a lullaby, strained and desperate. The hiss of steam from the locomotive. December 20th, 1876. 4:17 p.m. Chicago and Northwestern Railway Station. Chicago, Illinois. Sister Catherine Moreau stood on the frozen platform, watching 43 children board the cattle car that would carry them west to Montana Territory. Not a passenger car. A cattle car. Wooden walls. Straw-covered floor. A single pot-belly stove that would never produce enough heat for 43 bodies in sub-zero temperatures. No insulation. Gaps between the wall boards where wind and snow would pour through during the 1,000-mile journey. But it was all the Children's Aid Society could afford. Sister Catherine was 34 years old, a French-Canadian nun who dedicated her life to caring for orphaned and abandoned children in Chicago's overcrowded orphanages. She'd volunteered to accompany this group, the largest orphan train shipment of 1876, on their journey to new homes in the Montana mining camps. The children ranged from 3 years old to 14. Most were Irish or German immigrants, their parents dead from cholera, typhoid, or industrial accidents. Some had been abandoned, left on orphanage steps with notes pinned to their coats. Please care for her. I cannot feed her anymore. God, forgive me. A few had been removed from abusive homes by the courts. Others had lived on Chicago's streets, surviving by begging and theft, until police rounded them up and delivered them to the orphanage system. All of them were being sent west to be placed out, a Victorian-era practice where orphan children were transported by train to frontier communities and given to families who promised to feed, clothe, educate, and care for them. In theory, it was humanitarian. In practice, it was often slavery with a different name. Children were evaluated like livestock at train stops, families inspecting their teeth, their strength, their obedience. Strong boys went to farmers who needed free labor. Pretty girls went to families who needed domestic servants. The weak, the sick, the defiant were often left behind at the next station or simply abandoned along the route. But Sister Catherine had faith. She believed that God would protect these children, that Montana families, desperate for help in the brutal mining camps, would provide loving homes. She was wrong. All aboard, the conductor called, his breath puffing white in the December cold. Sister Catherine helped the youngest children climb into the cattle car. She'd brought blankets, 43 wool blankets purchased with donated funds, but they were thin, worn, barely adequate for Chicago winters, let alone the Montana mountains they'd be crossing. The children huddled together on the straw, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. Many were crying. Some coughed constantly, signs of respiratory infections that would worsen during the journey. A few tried to be brave. 10-year-old Thomas Flannery, an Irish orphan whose father had died in a factory fire and whose mother had succumbed to grief and laudanum addiction, stood near Sister Catherine, trying to comfort younger children. "It'll be all right," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "Sister Catherine says Montana's beautiful. Mountains and rivers and families who want us." But his eyes told a different story. He didn't believe it. None of them did. Sister Catherine knelt beside the children and led them in prayer. "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, deliver us from evil. Amen. Amen," the children whispered. The door slammed shut, locked from outside. The train lurched forward, and 43 children began the journey that would kill 29 of them. December 22nd, 1876, 11:43 p.m. Somewhere in Wyoming Territory. Temperature, -31 Fahrenheit. The cattle car had become a frozen tomb. The potbelly stove had gone out hours ago, the coal supply exhausted, and Sister Catherine had no way to get more. The train didn't stop except at scheduled stations, and the next station was 8 hours away. Snow poured through the gaps in the walls, accumulating in drifts inside the car. The children's breath froze in white clouds. Ice formed on the wooden walls. The temperature inside the car was barely warmer than outside. Sister Catherine had given her own coat to 3-year-old Mary O'Connor, the youngest child, who was shaking so violently her teeth chattered audibly. But it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. "Sister, I'm cold," 7-year-old Patrick Murphy whimpered. His lips blue, his small body curled into a ball beneath his inadequate blanket. "I know, darling," Sister Catherine said, her voice hoarse from shouting over the train noise, and from her own developing respiratory infection. "We'll reach a station soon. They'll give us more coal. Just hold on." But she knew the truth. They weren't going to make it. At 11:47 p.m., little Mary O'Connor stopped shivering. Sister Catherine was holding her, trying to share body heat, when she felt the child go still. Completely, utterly still. "Mary," Sister Catherine whispered. "Mary, sweetheart." No response. She felt for a pulse. Nothing. Mary O'Connor, 3 years old, blonde, with bright blue eyes that would never open again, had frozen to death in Sister Catherine's arms. Sister Catherine screamed, a raw, agonized sound that echoed through the cattle car. "No. No. God, no. Not the babies. Please, not the babies." The other children stared in horror as Sister Catherine rocked Mary's small, frozen body, weeping uncontrollably. And Thomas Flannery, 10 years old, trying to be brave, trying to be strong, began pounding on the locked door with his small fist. "Help us," he screamed. "Somebody help us. We're freezing. Please. Somebody. Anybody." But the train didn't stop. The engineer couldn't hear them over the noise of the locomotive. Or he could hear them and didn't care. Because orphans weren't people. They were cargo. And cargo didn't complain. By dawn on December 23rd, 6 more children were dead. December 24th, 1876. Christmas Eve. 9 m.m. Buddy. Montana Territory. The train pulled into Butte Station, a rough mining town that would become one of Montana's largest cities, but in 1876 was still a collection of crude buildings and desperate men. When railroad workers finally unlocked the cattle car door and pulled it open, they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 43 children, 29 frozen corpses, 14 barely alive. Sister Catherine Moreau was conscious, but hypothermic, frostbitten, and delirious. She was still holding Mary O'Connor's body, refusing to let go, whispering prayers in French that no one understood. The surviving children were in similar condition. Frostbite on their hands, feet, faces. Several had lost toes or fingers to necrosis. All had severe respiratory infections. Thomas Flannery had survived, but his hands were black from frostbite. A doctor would later amputate 3 fingers from his left hand and 2 from his right. The dead children were laid out on the station platform. 29 small bodies, frozen solid, their faces pale, their eyes closed. Sister Catherine had closed them all during the night. Whispering apologies she knew were worthless. The railroad initially tried to hide the disaster. They offered the station master $50 to dispose of the bodies quietly and report nothing. But the station master, a man named Richard Hughes who had 2 children of his own, refused. "These children have names," Hughes said, his voice shaking with rage. "They came from somewhere. Someone loved them, and you let them freeze to death like animals." He sent telegrams to every newspaper in Montana, Wyoming, and Chicago. By Christmas Day, the story was national news. September 25, 1876. Christmas Day, Butte, Montana Territory. The Children's Aid Society insisted the deaths were an unfortunate accident caused by unprecedented weather conditions. But investigators discovered the truth. The railroad had been warned that the cattle car was inadequate for transporting children in winter. They'd been offered a heated passenger car for an additional $80. They'd refused, claiming budget constraints. The coal supply for the stove had been insufficient from the start, enough for perhaps 12 hours, not the 5-day journey. And most damning, the cattle car door had been deliberately locked from outside, meaning even if the children had wanted to escape at a station stop, they couldn't. The Children's Aid Society had paid the railroad $2 per child for transportation, a total of $86. The railroad had saved $80 by using a cattle car instead of a passenger car. 29 children had frozen to death to save $80. Public outrage was immediate and intense. Newspapers called it the Christmas Massacre. Editorials demanded criminal prosecution. Churches held memorial services, but no one was ever charged. The railroad blamed the Children's Aid Society. The Children's Aid Society blamed the railroad. Everyone blamed unfortunate circumstances. And the 29 dead children were buried in a mass grave on a hillside outside Butte, marked with a single wooden cross that read, "The Frozen Children, Christmas 1876. They came seeking homes. They found only cold." Sister Catherine Moreau survived physically but never recovered mentally. She returned to Chicago, left the sisterhood, and spent the rest of her life in a private asylum, repeatedly drawing pictures of frozen children and whispering apologies. She died in 1891. Her final words, according to hospital records, were, "Mary, I'm so sorry, Mary. I couldn't save you." The 14 surviving children were placed with Montana families. Most were used as unpaid labor until they were old enough to escape. Several ran away and were never heard from again. Only 3 lived to adulthood. Thomas Flannery, who'd lost 5 fingers to frostbite, became a union organizer in the Butte mines, fighting for worker safety and children's rights. He died in 1943 at age 77, still carrying guilt that he'd survived when so many hadn't. In his unpublished memoir, discovered in 23 and now housed in the Montana Historical Society archives, he wrote, "I hear them every Christmas. The crying, the begging, the prayers. Sister Catherine singing lullabies to children who were already dead. I've lived 77 years since that night. I've had a wife, children, grandchildren. I've known warmth and love and comfort. But every December 24th, I'm 10 years old again, freezing in that cattle car, watching my friends die one by one, and knowing I can't save them. I've prayed for forgiveness. I've prayed for peace. But the cold never leaves. It's inside me, forever." The mass grave outside Butte was relocated in 1923 when the city expanded. The children's remains were supposed to be moved to the official cemetery. But when workers excavated the site, they found only 27 bodies. 2 were missing. No record exists of where those 2 bodies went, or if they were ever actually buried in the first place. In the decades since, there have been consistent reports from the old Butte Station site, now demolished, replaced by a parking lot and modern rail facility. Shadow figures of children appearing near the tracks at night. Apparitions of a woman in nun's habit, walking among the shadows, weeping. Frost patterns appearing on windows in the shape of small handprints, even in summer. Audio phenomena. Children crying, heard most frequently in late December. A woman's voice singing a French lullaby. Fais dodo, mon petit frère. Phantom train sounds, wheels on tracks, steam hissing, even though no trains run on that route anymore. Faint voices whispering, I'm cold. So cold. Please help us. Physical phenomena. Sudden temperature drops of 40-50 degree F in specific locations, lasting minutes before returning to normal. Feelings of overwhelming sadness and guilt that cause witnesses to break down crying without knowing why. Frost forming on skin. Witnesses report their hands and faces developing frost patterns that melt within seconds, leaving no physical damage but a lingering sensation of cold. Documented incidents. December 29. A railroad maintenance crew working near the old station site reported hearing children crying at 2 a.m. When they investigated, they found no source. But their equipment, thermometers, phones, flashlights, all malfunctioned simultaneously. When they checked later, video footage from a security camera showed shadow figures of children standing on the tracks before vanishing. December 2015. A woman named Jennifer Martinez was driving past the old station site on Christmas Eve when her car stalled. While waiting for a tow truck, she heard tapping on her window. When she looked, she saw a child's handprint forming in the frost on the glass. A small hand pressed against the window from outside, but no child was visible. The handprint remained for 3 days before fading. December 2021. A paranormal investigation team spent Christmas Eve at the site. They recorded over 37 distinct child voices on EVP. Electronic voice phenomena. The most disturbing. Sister Catherine promised we'd be warm, she lied. They all lied. And most chilling, several team members reported waking Christmas morning with severe frostbite on their extremities. Fingers, toes, ears, despite sleeping in heated sleeping bags inside a temperature-controlled RV. Medical examination confirmed tissue damage consistent with extended exposure to temperatures below -20 Fahrenheit. But the temperature inside the RV never dropped below 68 Fahrenheit. Silence, wind howling, child's voice, faint and far away, singing. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Present day. Butte, Montana. December 24th. Every Christmas Eve, locals placed toys at the old station site. Teddy bears, dolls, wooden trains. By Christmas morning, they're gone. Not stolen, not blown away by wind. Just gone. As if small hands carried them away. As if 29 frozen children finally received the Christmas gifts they never got in 1876. The memorial plaque installed by the Montana Historical Society in 1998 reads, "In memory of the orphan train children. 29 died here, December 1876. May they find the warmth and love they were promised." But those who visit the site say the children are still waiting, still cold, still crying, still begging for someone to unlock the door, to let them out, to take them home. Because in December 1876, 43 children boarded a train, seeking families and hope and Christmas miracles. 29 froze to death in a cattle car, while America celebrated the birth of a child in a warm manger. And their spirits never left, never found warmth, never found home. They're still on that train, still freezing, still crying. Forever. Go to sleep, my little brother. Go to sleep, you will have milk. But there was no milk, no warmth, no Christmas, only cold, forever cold. The hanging tree remembers. Bannack, Montana, where the sheriff was the outlaw, where Christmas meant execution, where 21 men were hanged without trial, where 29 children froze to death in a locked cattle car, where 43 people burned alive in a church on Christmas Eve, where the dead still hang, where the murdered still scream. The gallows are gone, but the hanging tree remains, bearing rope scars that won't heal after 160 years. The cattle car is gone, but the crying never stopped. The church is ash, but the singing still echoes from the ruins. The boarding house burned, but the footsteps still walk through empty rooms. The stagecoach is splinters, but it still rides on phantom wheels. Visit if you dare, but remember, in Bannack, justice never dies. The hanged never rest. The frozen never warm. The murdered never forgive. And Christmas is forever stained with blood.